Well, thanks a lot. It's really great to be here. As Aaron said, been a big supporter of NCAA since the beginning, and it really gives me great pride in that, when we started the organization, I think there was 10 of us or so in 2010, and I feel like every time I see his staff, I swell with pride because they say, oh, we're up to 500, we're up to 550, business, dues-paying business members. So it really is, it's the DEA drug dog, it's onto us. So it's such a wonderful organization. I'll start with something just pretty important. There's a party going on Wednesday night at my law firm. It's a party fundraiser for the United for Care campaign. That is the measure that's on the ballot this November in Florida. Really hope that we can win that. Let's give them a round of applause. Let's do this, Florida. So we will be having an insider briefing from Eric Stevens about how the campaign's going. Open to everyone. It's really only about 5 or 10 minute walk from the convention here. So please head on down. I'm just going to give a couple very brief comments at the beginning, then we'll turn things over to our wonderful speakers. I think it's just profound that we are here in Colorado at this moment. Not many people are aware of this, but when marijuana became illegal back in 1937 at the federal level, the first person arrested under that new federal law was a man named Samuel Caldwell here in Colorado. So it's just sort of phenomenal that Colorado sort of began the war on marijuana in a way. And that gentleman went to jail for 3 years, by the way, for small-time distribution. And now here we are as really kind of the cutting edge of where marijuana legalization and where marijuana commerce is going. So really wonderful to be here at this time. As Aaron said, I was very involved in the campaign to legalize marijuana, which passed here in 2012. And I'm happy to report I think it's really been very successful in terms of how the implementation's been rolling out. It's only really been about 18 months since we legalized marijuana as a state, and about 6 months since we've had the sort of commercial system in place that you currently see with stores and so forth for legal recreational marijuana. So it's a little tough to say exactly. I don't have tons of data on how things are going, on usage rates and things like that are important to keep an eye on. What's happening with teen usage, what's happening with driving, tax revenue. The state's been good at tracking that. We've brought in tens of millions of dollars of tax revenue, and I think that's worth pausing on for a moment because really that money was just going into the hands of the underground market and cartels for years and years and years, and now it's being captured by our state. It's not only using that money for public schools, we're also using about $25 million, and we've already set that aside for things like treatment for people with drug problems, prevention, youth education on marijuana. So again, that is from the sale of marijuana now going into these positive things in our state. On top of that, we've produced over 10,000 direct jobs in Colorado in this industry. 10,000, that's pretty phenomenal, and we'll hear from Eliott and some other people today that employ a lot of individuals and pay them good living wages. Many of them get health care, and I think that's worth certainly reflecting on. In addition to that, there's thousands of indirect jobs. People like my law firm, we have 20-some individuals, all we do is marijuana law. And construction industry, there's been tons of just job creation driven by these laws. Besides that, we also are setting aside about $10 million from our state medical marijuana program to research medical marijuana, right? We know that there's millions of people in our country who really use marijuana, medical marijuana legally, 130,000 in Colorado that are on the state rolls, but the research has not always been there, right? We need more research, and our state is setting aside a significant amount of money to fund actual marijuana research, right, to see the positive things that are going on with medical marijuana. Wanted to also just point out one or two other things. I wanted to apologize in advance because my wife is actually 40 weeks pregnant. Today is her due date. And if I have my phone here by the ready. If I need to run out, let's give her a round of applause. Why not? Send the positive mojo. If I need to run out, one of my capable staff members will jump up here. But I bring that up not only because I think I should be in the running for NCIA Supporter of the Year for being here, but also because I just think that is profound, that we're going to have children in Colorado and Washington that are born into a world where marijuana prohibition is just a relic of the past, right? I mean, it's amazing. It's simply amazing. My daughter will grow up thinking that is marijuana prohibition. It didn't make any sense. I can't believe that policy existed, right? It's like alcohol prohibition. We look back on that and it's just nonsense. How many millions of people's lives were destroyed and negatively impacted by marijuana prohibition? It's almost impossible to count. So I think this is a new dawn and just exciting to be here. So I'm going to turn things over to our speakers, and they're going to talk a bit about the challenges as well as the positive aspects of legalization in their particular states. But I wanted to know, in case you're thinking about sneaking out, you shouldn't, because at the very end of when these gentlemen speak, I'm going to ask them what I think is a pretty tough question, and I want to know: is there an existential threat to legalization out there? Right? Is there an issue that we are grappling with right now that if we don't get it right, then the pendulum may swing back towards prohibition? And I think, this is new, right? Marijuana legalization is new. And I think a lot of us are maybe taking this for granted and say, oh, we got these big wins, we're going to win more this year in Oregon, Alaska, Florida, blah, blah, blah. I think there are some real threats out there, and I want to hear from these gentlemen if they feel the same way, and if so, how potentially do we address those? So I think I'm going to start with Washington, if that's okay with you, gentlemen. And I'll sort of introduce our first speaker is John Davis. John Davis is the founder of the Northwest Patient Resource Center, which is a dispensary there in Seattle. And he also has been involved for years with an event that I am blown away by every time I attend, which is Seattle Hemp Fest. As a guy who's been working on marijuana policy for about a decade, I've been to a lot of marijuana events. Seattle Hemp Fest is by far the most excellent marijuana event I have ever been to. Hundreds of thousands of people, wonderful event. He's been involved with that since 1994. The final thing I would throw out there about John is he's currently working on a project with the former president of Mexico, President Vicente Fox, no relation to Brian Vicente, on creating an international dialogue about cannabis policy reform. So with that, let's give a round of applause to John Davis.
Thank you. So I was asked to come here and speak, and the title of this is Colorado and Washington, Success and Challenges from the Frontier of Post-Prohibition America. Well, post-prohibition is, I think that's a little bit soon to be using those type of terms. But in thinking about this, I decided to lead with the successes that we've had in Washington. And I think that overall, the most important success that we've had in Washington, this was also in Colorado, was the psychological effect of simply passing a legalization initiative. No one at the time knew what that meant, if the federal government was going to respect it. But the legalization vote in Washington, Colorado, was the most important event that happened in this industry since California legalized medical marijuana in 1996. And it sort of forced the government's hand. Okay, the two states now are in violation of the 1961 Single Convention Treaty. The 61 Single Convention Treaty, which is an international treaty, it allows for medical and for research, if you read the treaty. This is recreational. This is the first time that's happened, and no one really knew how everyone was going to react. And so far, it seems that the government is, the federal government is willing to allow it to happen. It's not, parts of the government aren't happy. But overall, the notion of legalization, which is being called the Great Experiment, is going to be allowed to continue. Since legalization, the vote on legalization, which in Washington is still a little bit theoretical, the polling has jumped between 10 and 15% nationwide for those in favor of legalization, with now the polling numbers being around 56%, 58% of the entire country, including those people in Oklahoma, wanting outright legalization, and over 2/3 of those people in our nation wanting some form of legalization, including medical. And the conversation is not just happening here. The conversation, just because of the initiatives passing, has been spread throughout the world. They just had last week they had a special in Australia that was the Cannabis Inc. of Australia. And there's so many of these other countries that are now looking at us and saying, wait a second, wasn't it the United States that put this on us, and now they're going away from it? Does this make any sense? The conversation is happening south of the border. A lot of people don't know that the drug war really impacts those south of the border. And if you look at the usage rates of Mexicans of drugs, they are far less than we have up here in the United States. The United States is one of the most drug-using countries on earth. Mexico does not have a drug problem. They have a border problem. They are on the border with a country that is a very large drug consumer, and a lot of people don't realize that there's been over 80,000 confirmed casualties, direct confirmed casualties from the war on drugs since 1996. 1,500 of those confirmed children. We have journalists that are kidnapped, killed. We have truckloads of beheaded corpses dumped on the side of the road, but that's down there. So we don't think of this as a true war because people aren't dying here, because the cartels know if you turn up bodies on this side of the border, there's going to be problems. Down there, apparently they don't care so much. And now the claim that, and we heard this a lot before for years, that it will never be allowed to happen. Now we can pretty much put that behind us. And now we can look at the other states and start to look at a path forward. What this did, what these votes did, especially in the case of Washington, is create a framework, a scaffolding in which we can build on. What's been done in Washington and Colorado is not perfect, but I've been working on drug policy for a couple of decades now, and I've yet to see the perfect legislation. Basically what has always happened is we've taken small baby steps, we've shored up our position, and we've taken the next step. And each one of those steps is faltering. It's not perfect. We take it up in the next legislative cycle. And also, what's been a success in Washington is the legalization vote is starting to force the localities in Washington to actually take this seriously and to think about what it's going to take for zoning, what it's going to take for occupancy and uses. A lot of people don't realize just how important for businesses that the localities are. They think, oh, it's state legal, problem solved. No, you still have to get into your localities. But this has been forcing the hands of the localities, and now they're beginning to figure out just exactly how they're going to issue a building permit for the large-scale production of a Schedule I substance. And that brings us to the end of Washington's successes, unfortunately. Washington has a lot of problems. As you know, Colorado, they're passing out a brochure around where you can actually go within a mile and find some recreational cannabis. That's not the case in Washington yet. And Washington had done some things very differently. And for you people in various states, I think it's really important for you to look at what happened in Colorado, what happened in Washington, and even some things happened in California in various areas, so that as you are going to the next steps of changing your laws, you can learn from mistakes that are made. And believe me, we're going to get over these mistakes. It's just a process. It's a small baby step forward. Challenges. Washington, when it was legalized and when it was kicked to the Liquor Control Board and when there was a lot of talk about what it was going to look like, this notion of legalization, they did not want to think about it from a business perspective, because at the time, you know, it's big bad business. Business is going to come up and they are going to advertise to your children, and business is just bad. And understandable. And when the industry reached out to the Liquor Control Board and the powers that be, there were a lot of people in the community that were what one of my colleagues calls whacktivists. And these are very passionate but very politically naive people in the medical community typically. And instead of engaging positively with the process, with the Liquor Control Board, with the legislature, they decided that loud was active and just kind of went down and started accusing the Liquor Control Board of things and a number of other things, just being a real pain, shouting and not really having a clear message. And I think that that really turned the Liquor Control Board off. They went to the academics and said, hey, academics, how do you do this? Well, academics are not engaged in the business of cannabis. And the business of cannabis is a tricky one. There's a lot to know in the business of cannabis in order to keep your supply line right, in order to keep on a bank, in order to keep on the right side of taxation. And that their desire was to weight the system to what they called, quote, mom and pops. But in weighting it to the mom and pops, they didn't really want to have any capital requirements. They didn't want to require any experience. They didn't want vertical integration. In fact, the initiative forbids it. So we can't, if we're on the retail side, we can't grow our own. And they didn't want to necessarily give medical, which doesn't have the same amount of regulation in Washington as it did in Colorado, a path to legalization. They ended up, their property requirement was a sham. It really was meaningless. People didn't really have to be tied to property. They could list a Kentucky Fried Chicken and say, well, it's distant, it has distance relationships, fine, and they would be allowed to change it later. Then they ended up limiting the number of licenses per entity. I mean, these are not things that are likely to lure investment into a market. You know, you're trying to keep, you can only have 3 stores, and you have all these other challenges. It's made it a lot more difficult. And then they took the growers, who initially could have 3 tier 3s, which are in Washington State is 30,000 square feet. They reduced that to 21,000 square feet and said you can only have 1. So a lot of people that had taken a business approach and actually taken and secured these facilities, they're holding high overhead. Well, and then you're playing against someone that has no overhead, no experience. Their one commonality was, it weights it to you if you can game a system. And that's just the way it is. Restricting out-of-state money, bad idea. Why would you not want to have money in to help build your infrastructure? It just makes it more difficult. Then the Liquor Control Board, they've consistently changed the rules and their interpretation of the rules. And as I say, the existing industry has had some sway, but they've decided, they're going to take more of an academic approach. Whereas Colorado took the existing medical and let the existing medical go over. Also, they were a lot farther along with their localities and building permits because they had to create 70% of everything that they sold out of the retail stores. So they had to get the building permits in place. And they had that ready to go. And that's why you saw Colorado actually roll out with some product first. I can't stress enough the localities' roles in implementation. It's in Washington State, we're still in the process of going into the individual localities and working with them to get some sort of zoning, some sort of occupancy and use, and some sort of a way to get building permit. Then again, now you overlay it with all the bureaucracies. You have clean air, environmental, solid waste, fire, water, labor and industries, Department of Agriculture. And those, it's a process with those people. They're nervous about standing out on the branch alone. They have to be worked with in order to figure out, okay, the solid waste, what is it? Is it cannabis? Can we put it in a train? And can that train go over to Oregon, crossing a border? Can we treat it like any other solid waste? Is it hazardous waste? What is it? Those questions are still being answered in Washington. Then, of course, you have the other factors. You know, it's contrary to federal law. Banks won't work with cannabis industry, not even on the ancillaries, not yet. And then the tax challenges with 280E are immense. I'm still wondering how we're going to, how retailers are going to manage to file compliant and still not go broke. We've achieved a lot, and what we've got to do in Washington now is we're going to have to show, let the system turn on July 1st, and we're going to have to show a little failure. We're going to have to let the media say, okay, well, this system is imperfect, because we're going to do like we always did. We're going to come back in, we're going to figure out what works, what doesn't, and we're going to make some changes. And this is an ongoing process. As my good friend Vivian McPeak often says, that legalization is not an event, it's a process. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot, John. That was a really great overview. We'll turn things over in a second to our other panelists from Washington State, and then we'll focus in on our two Colorado panelists. I did want to point out, too, in terms of John's comments, the banking issue and the tax issue with 280E are two of just the cornerstones of NCIA's sort of work. They've been going after these issues and lobbying on them for years. There's a panel with my close friend and colleague tomorrow with Steve Fox about banking, and I really suggest you check that out. So I'm going to turn things over to our next speaker from Washington State, Roger Goodman. And Roger, I got to know him. He's a state representative in Washington, and I got to know him probably 8 years ago, 8 or 9 years ago, when he was really doing some groundbreaking work with the King County Bar Association, and that is the attorney association for Seattle, right? And as a young, aspiring attorney myself, I noticed that they were putting out these position papers saying that the war on drugs was a failure and maybe we should rethink marijuana policies. And at that time, that was really inspiring to me. And I was actually able to reach out to Roger and get the Colorado Bar Association to start to take some similar steps back in the year. So it's really my great pleasure to turn things over to Roger Goodman. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Just stand up so I can see you guys better. I was just going to say it's a pleasure to be back in Denver. I've been here many times working with Brian for, I think it's been a dozen years, actually. The time has really flown by. Getting the professional voice to speak up against cannabis prohibition, against the war on drugs in general, and look at the work, you know, the groundwork we laid. It's really, I kind of have to pinch myself. Don't see a lot of tie-dye and fringy ponytail reggae people out here. As a matter of fact, I used to be the oldest person in the audience, and I'm not anymore. So this is really quite a shift. So I think what I want to do is give you an update of some of the details of what's going on in Washington State. After my reform work with Brian in Colorado and other states, I became sort of notorious in my area. A seat became open in the state legislature. I ran, and they hit me hard. They used all those key words. Roger Goodman is a lawyer crusading to legalize drugs and all that sort of thing. Big hit pieces arrived at the voters' doors, and my poll numbers shot up afterwards. And so that really was a cultural sign, though, that I was fighting for the truth and had the courage as a politician to talk about this. And people were, it was amazing. They say, wow, really? You're saying this? It's amazing. And so I beg my opponents in every election to hit me on the drug issue because it always backfires on them. If they say I raise taxes, that's different. Then I'm vulnerable. So now I find myself as the chair of the Public Safety Committee in the State House of Representatives, which used to have jurisdiction over cannabis, but it's legal now. So I don't even have jurisdiction over the substance that I helped to legalize. So it's sort of an irony there. I'm also practicing law. I'm of counsel with Henry Wykowski. Henry Wykowski has opened an office in Seattle, and so I'm also servicing cannabis businesses in Washington State. So really have an inside view, day to day, on what it's like for those who want to produce and process and sell at the retail, and the regulatory burdens and so forth. I want to echo what John said, and John Davis really is a pioneer in Washington State. Been working with him for a decade as well. John was talking about the sort of acceptance of the initiative. You know, all of the soccer moms and the sheriffs and so forth who oppose the initiative are now saying, well, you know, that's it, let's do it. They're accepting it, acknowledging it, and even embracing it. And I think it's also in view of the fact that we are, despite bumps in the road, developing a rigorous, strict regulatory system that's going to satisfy public opinion. And a little bit advanced to answer Brian's provocative question about could this possibly reverse, I don't think so. I really don't think so. It was a little bit of a surprise to us who were alive back when Reagan was elected that everything, you know, Jimmy Carter said, it looked like it was all going to happen back in the late 70s, early 80s. And then boy did it whiplash against us. I do have to say though, I was with Jimmy Carter not long ago in Atlanta and spoke at length with him about his position on marijuana. And he does not believe marijuana should be legalized. He thinks it's a dangerous substance, that it's going to be marketed to children, and that it's going to, you know, cause cancer. Almost all of his family members have died from lung cancer related to tobacco, and he has that in his mind as associating tobacco with cannabis. So he's strongly opposed to cannabis legalization and is in favor of decriminalization. And I got into a debate with him. I said, you know, don't you want to regulate the market and get rid of the criminal enterprises? Wouldn't that be a better way to protect children and families and public safety? I kind of stumped him. But just to let you know, Jimmy Carter was never in favor of legalization. So maybe it's not a surprise that we didn't make it happen way back when. But now the dam has burst. The industry is sitting right here. We are unstoppable. And I think if you put your finger to the wind, you see public opinion is continuing to go in the same direction. I compare same-gender relationships with cannabis legalization. There's still a ceiling, a cultural acceptability, a ceiling on same-gender relationships. Some people are still grossed out by it. But when you talk about cannabis legalization, it's a plant. And the rapid cultural change, the acceptance of cannabis as a plant that ought to be regulated and not prohibited and driven into the criminal market is rapidly gaining acceptance. So I just don't think it's going to go back. I mean, maybe I'll be proven wrong, but I think we're there. This is a great example of what's called discontinuous change. Nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens, and then the Berlin Wall falls, right? So for us, Colorado and Washington, the Berlin Wall has fallen for cannabis prohibition. I predict in 2019 that if Hillary wants to get reelected, she's going to have to bring down the wall of federal prohibition in order to become popular enough to get reelected president. So we'll see. 5 more years of federal prohibition. That's my prediction. So on the ground, the Liquor Control Board in the state, which we're going to rename the Liquor and Cannabis Board, which is pretty cool. Same letters, actually, won't have to change the stationery or anything, is doing the best job they can. They're used to bottles of vodka. They're not used to an agricultural product. And so they are making they're learning along the way, and sometimes behaving like bureaucrats and hindering the development of the market. The initial phase here, and we are sort of letting Colorado run interference for us to see what lessons you're learning. Well, we're right behind you. The first retail shop should be opening in the first couple of weeks of July. But we're really penetrating the market very, very slowly. Colorado already had a statewide uniform regulatory system for medical cannabis. And we didn't. We have sort of a patchwork of local control, quasi-legal. I mean, we do have an initiative on the books, but the medical cannabis system is sort of quasi-legal, so we don't have anything to build on. So we really have to invent something new, which is what we're doing, and then figure out a way to align medical cannabis with the new retail, the full access market. By the way, I do not use, and I'm about to say the word, recreational as a word. I think that word diminishes the use of cannabis, and I don't go out for a recreational beer. And those of you who use tobacco, you don't go out for a recreational cigarette, you know. And so I don't think, I would encourage you not to use that word, and Steve D'Angelo used the phrase full access market or general adult use. And so I really try to use those words. I say there's medical cannabis and there's general adult use cannabis, or general use, but not recreational. Try not to use that word because it just comes across as something less than what it should be. So we are now licensing 2 million square feet of canopy. The Liquor Control Board is assuming that about 50% of the businesses that will receive licenses will fail, either for a failed crop or bad business plan. And so those 2 million square feet of canopy are estimated to satisfy about 15% of the demand, only 15% of the demand. So we're just getting started. 25% of the demand in Washington State, and this is probably true nationwide, is people under the age of 21. So there will always be an unregulated market for those under 21. And then the other 75% of that, 50%, is completely unregulated, and then the other 25% is medical cannabis. So we're starting to supplant, undercut the unregulated market and, to a certain extent, medical cannabis. It's a very high-risk venture. It really is. I mean, for anyone who wants to get into the business, as John was saying, it's sort of unpredictable what the bureaucrats are doing. So you may invest in a property, you're paying rent, you don't have a license yet, you don't know if you're going to get one, and then the liquor board changes the rules and you have to wait another few months. And so for those who are getting into this, you really need the resources, otherwise, and quite a number of applicants have withdrawn because they found they don't have the resources to continue. So the challenges, again, are banking. We have one credit union in the state that's willing to provide merchant services. We're also, I'm actually working on a deal where retailers and maybe other sectors of the market would join an association, and a bank, yet to be named, would service the association rather than the individual businesses. But the banking issue is still huge, still a cash business, as you know. This is the major challenge. And I'd rather actually answer questions about what's going on with Washington than continue to talk at you. But very, very exciting. We're moving in the right direction, bumps in the road. I think in terms of medical, we will be probably licensing medical grows, small scale, licensing a few medical retail, but in general, it really is going to be this general adult use. I am concerned about truly medically needy individuals who need a lot and might not be served through the market. So as a legislator, I'm wanting to make sure that we provide for the truly medically needy who consume a lot. They don't smoke, they don't vaporize, they probably ingest. To make oil, you need a lot of plant material and so forth. So that's my major concern. And then locals. The other thing, one big difference between Colorado and Washington is that we don't have arguably a local opt-out. Our Attorney General has said that locals can opt out, but that's going to be litigated. I'm in favor of revenue sharing, saying to the locals, whether it's counties or cities, we'll give you a share of the revenue. The locals aren't ideologically opposed to this so much as they just want to cut. They want to be able to pay to play. And so that's the other thing that we're going to be moving forward in the legislature, is to provide some local revenue sharing to make it a statewide market. So pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Roger. Wonderful to have elected officials here speaking to the group. So we're now going to shift and talk about Colorado, and I wanted to kind of remind folks we are going to have sort of an open Q&A at the end of this. So we'll have two speakers from Colorado talking about the successes and challenges of legalization here, and then we'll have some questions from the audience. So if you have any burning questions please hang on to him. We'll get to him soon. So I'm going to have first speak Eliott Klug. Eliott is the CEO and co-founder of Pink House Blooms, which is a prominent medical marijuana and adult use dispensary here in Colorado. They really have a reputation for being really top of the class. Eliott comes from a background in oil and gas as well as agriculture, so he brings a lot of business acumen to this field. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eliott. Thanks. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Brian, for the glowing review there. The successes and challenges, to me, seem to overlap in this industry. The things that have made us successful here in Colorado are also some of the biggest challenges going forward. And I think the prior panelists have covered it. The cliche is all politics are local. And in this industry, we are the political face of the commercial side of the movement, as well as, hopefully, maybe not all of us, but hopefully for the patients and the people who have helped create this opportunity. Here in Colorado, we've seen regular change from both legislative and the regulatory side. Pretty much every 3 months once things got going. The first law passed for the constitutional change, which opened the door for the opportunity, but we existed as a caregiver model, and it was all still kind of borderline underground. Once the elections in 2008 happened, you saw a lot more people become openly advertising that they're running a commercial-style caregiver business. And that triggered the city of Denver to make the first move to push us into a regulated retail outlet and a regulated production model. And during that time, even the building departments didn't know what to do. So a lot of these grows, up until even the last couple of years, have existed outside of traditional building codes and requirements. And that level of exposure to the regulatory bodies for the marijuana industry is what's defining the go-forward path. We're really regulatory management companies here in Colorado. We do produce a product and we sell it, but we have to manage and provide data to these regulatory bodies to give comfort to the federal government that we're accomplishing, the 8 bullet points on their memo. The politics are extremely local because your local municipalities and your state regulatory entities, those are the people that are really answering to the federal government saying, hey, we're doing our best to prevent diversion. We're doing our best to prevent child consumption. And you'll see also that's where the biggest foot dragging is going to come from. The bureaucracies are not going to want to readily assume the burden for playing interference with the federal government for you. And it's a big request to say, hey, let these guys and gals produce a Schedule I substance in the middle of what the federal government still considers active prohibition. And so it behooves you to know who your local entities are so that you can have comfort with them, that your investments and opportunities are going to be stable, and that you're making good business decisions. And as in Colorado, we've learned once the rules get rolling, plan for 3 to 6 month incremental changes legislatively or regulatorily. I've come to be excited when legislation is no longer in session and nothing can change there. But the regulatory bodies can issue emergency warnings and change rules on the fly, and all of a sudden you could be caught, buying something that's not available, doesn't exist on the market. So my answer to the challenge of what could derail this is if we don't develop good business to government relations with our regulators, we'll slow ourselves down. There's probably never going back, but it's our turn to show that we can run a business and work with the government, because the government is already there. You're trying to become a business and you need their permission to do so. So you're going to have to, the activism is important, but the business relationship is really where we're making big changes. You know, we at Pink House have always sought to have a strong relationship with our city, with our licensing department, because that's the person that inspects you. That's the person that tells you yes or no right away. And it's, you can be upset that there's a regulatory body, or you can figure out how to be participatory and work through the regulation system. So, like I said, the success is that we're doing it. We're selling recreational marijuana. The rules change regularly and the taxes are high, but here we are doing it. And it's going to change. So be prepared for change continuously.
Thanks so much, Eliott. Excellent to hear from a producer and distributor's perspective. And our final speaker, we're very excited to have Andrew Freedman is the Director of Marijuana Coordination for the Office of the Governor of the State of Colorado. So Andrew, his just kind of brief background, he's a Harvard Law grad, and he was the Chief of Staff for the Lieutenant Governor of Colorado, and now he is the first ever Director of Marijuana Coordination for the state. So I'll let him speak a bit about challenges and successes from his vantage point. Let's give a hand to Andrew.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Brian, Christian and Brian, for those that don't know, and I think all of you would know, are really big thought leaders in Colorado, not only for the Amendment 64 work that they did, but also ongoing, are kind of the people who see around corners better than anybody else, and so they're not fighting the tests, the challenges that we have today. They're seeing the challenges they're going to have in 3 years. And so it's that kind of thought process and thought partners that made me want to come here today, because my hope is that we are going to be cultivating that spirit a lot here, because we have a big challenge. And so I am the Governor's Director of Marijuana Coordination, which is a title that all of my law school friends are very jealous of, which makes up for the pay cut. The job really came around, this is less to do with the debate over marijuana legalization and more to do with, we can have the debate as much as we want. I tend to not enter into that debate, because the other thing we have to do is implement a system that no one's implemented yet, and we have to do it without federal oversight. And so we are in this incredibly new territory, which requires a lot of good government work. And so I consider my role to be a good government role, and have very little to do with marijuana and more to do with, as Eliott was talking about, the kind of business relationships and the kind of forward-thinking relationships that can get us to a place where we have equitable and fair regulatory systems that really do protect our youth, protect public safety, and protect public health. And so it's the kind of conversations that we have to have with what's not going to strangle the industry, but what is going to work here. And it is, like everyone has said to this point, going to be an ongoing conversation, because we've never done this before. And we certainly, not only have we never done it for marijuana, but nobody's ever regulated an industry just on the state level without it also being a federal conversation. So what have we done well? I would say the Amendment 64 Task Force, a year worth of work after Amendment 64 was passed, to put together just hundreds of people working on what are all the places that need to be regulated, and that was business interests mixed with people who were marijuana proponents and opponents, also legal, public safety people, public health people, all getting together in a room and saying, what do we need to do to get this up and running, creating the kind of omnibus package that says, here you go, here's the bare bones, here's what we need to do to be ready to go on January 1st, and surprisingly enough, we were ready to go on January 1st, and I think that is the biggest miracle so far. The skeleton of that entire thing, and what really allowed for, I think, a lot of people to calm down, including the federal government, is that we have an inventory tracking system that was ready to go on day one, and just barely on day one, as I think a lot of retailers know, that we can track every single clone all the way to maturity and to the point of sale, and know that this is how much you're throwing away, this is how much is going to fruition, that kind of information ends up to be such a crucial part of the skeleton of us being able to regulate and enforce this and know where the legitimate marijuana is being sold to help us regulate the gray market and the black market. That really was the skeleton. I would say that is the Department of Revenue's work on that and getting that all up and working in such a short time frame is really the home run hit that we've had so far. And so everything that we do on a regulatory basis will really build off that model. The other thing that I would say that we continue to do is while we monitor anecdotes, we monitor data, we're hyper vigilant at trying to get on top of things because we don't want things to escalate out of control and then have to come back to it. We still do it in a way that we're reaching out to industry, we're reaching out to concerned people, to public health. And so I think we're doing a good job of not being overly reactionary and more at coming up with smart solutions. I think the Edible Task Force is a good way of showing it, and Brian's partner Christian is on that with us. Again, we see anecdotes, we see things going wrong. We're hearing a lot about out-of-state users overindulging, a lot of new people into the market, and everybody's working together for it. That's what we've done well so far. How are we doing? Well, obviously the sky hasn't fallen, and I think that is the most we'd ever be able to say at this point. And so I always caution both sides. I get a lot of, this is the worst thing that's ever happened. I said, there's no data to support that. And they're, okay, well, nothing bad is ever going to happen. There's no data to support that either. It's going to take 5-10 years to really work out the exact impact of this stuff with public health, with public education. It's going to take a long time. Now, all that being said, we haven't seen a significant increase in crime. We haven't seen a significant increase in usage. You know, the world has not ended the day January 1st when the first recreational stop opened up. It's all data that we want to get a hold of and we want to have a better picture, but we're doing that, and we're moving for government at a speed unseen before. We've so far brought in about $18 million in marijuana revenue through April, which I think is in line, maybe a little bit lower than we initially forecasted, but in the ballpark of where we thought we would be. Obviously, there's been thousands of jobs created from the market, and we are still just working on taking in initial data. And then I'm going to end with, because I really want us to get to questions and have time for that, what we're working on, and I'll be quick with this. So we're working on edibles pretty hard right now, and there's been a task force that has been put together for that, again, with representatives from industry and from public health and from concerned citizens. The basic premise of that, there's kind of two standards in there. One, like always, how do we try to prevent accidental ingestion by young people? And the second one being, how do we make it without taking in mind the consumer who's walking in without any sort of culture, public education on this, without knowing anything about it, how do we make it intuitive when they're having one serving? So that they should know how much they're eating, absent any bud tender telling them how much they should split it up into. And so I think what you'll see over the course of the next couple months is emergency rulemaking that will come out that says a serving size should probably line up in some way, either a demarcation or a stamp or a physical product separation between what is a serving and what is a product size. On banking, we're as concerned as anyone. I actually am very jealous of Washington, of having a credit union that had enough faith to just come out and say we're going to do it, because that's not something we've had yet in Colorado. And I think we've been working actually with Washington State and Governor Inslee on trying to go together to find a federal solution to this, because I think every other solution will be on shaky territory, and I think that's what the bankers are saying as well. However, we're going to do everything we can. And so we passed a bill last session that allows for the formation of basically a credit union style co-op that can go straight to the Federal Reserve and ask for access without having to get federal insurance, which seems to be a roadblock. We're pushing forward for credit unions to create marijuana-only credit unions. Any solution's a good solution to us. We want the cash off the streets. We want a banking solution. And so we are helping everybody advocate any position out there. And the final thing that we're working really hard on is youth prevention. And so over the coming months, I hope that we will come out with our youth prevention campaign, which will really be closer to, it won't be about the legalization debate. It'll be about teenage use and what it does for teenage use. We've been working closely with industry on that one to get their feedback on where it goes. But I think everyone can understand that one of the things that would really stop legalization in its tracks is if we see a dramatic increase in youth use from it. Not to say that is where we see the data going, but that it's beholden on all of us to make sure it stays out of the hands of people under the age of 21. And so those are the big things we're working on. Again, it's an incredibly fascinating field day to day. So thank you for having me here.
Well, thanks so much, Andrew. It's really nice to see that the governor of Colorado take a sort of thoughtful and collaborative approach to marijuana reform. We didn't exactly see eye to eye on the campaign. He campaigned against us. So now that the Colorado voters have endorsed this, it's nice to see that we can have a conversation and try to find some common ground. So I'm going to take my broad discretion as a moderator and ask one or two very quick questions. We have a bunch of really good questions from the audience. So I just wanted to hit on what we talked about at the beginning. And I think Eliott had some good insight on this, but I'm going to ask each speaker to just kind of briefly address this, which is there an existential threat to legalization? And is there a policy issue that you're seeing related to this, and how can we kind of grapple with this? So let's maybe jump. Let's hit, Andrew, are you prepared for this?
Sure. Can you describe a little bit what you mean by the existential threat?
Sure. With the fact that marijuana has really only been legal for about 18 months, is there a chance that marijuana, the pendulum will swing back and legalization will be overturned? And if so, what's the issue that would make that happen? Is it edibles? Is it labeling? Is it banking? Is it business to government relations not being good enough? Thoughts on that, Andrew?
So I take it, with the second I got this job, my awesome girlfriend picked up the book Smoke Signals, which is a history of the legalization effort. And I'll tell you that this might be a new place we are before, but it certainly is similar to places we were before that have been turned back, and there have been a new war on drugs or an upping of the war on marijuana. And so I will always say yes, there's a complete chance that a year from now, everybody says, well, that was nice, but that's done now. That's a politics question. I don't have a good read on where the politics will go nationally. So I wouldn't come in there. I would say the shakiness that we have is tied up almost completely in banking. That is the last bastion of making sure that this is a legitimate industry, and it is really where I see the most kind of nefarious influences coming in at this point. That if we can prove, as I think that it has been proved, that regulation helps and that regulation can be smart and it can be part of the system and that we can do this as far as best practices, that's all great. But if it becomes a big money laundering operation and it becomes another foothold in for nefarious operations, I think there's a whole separate ground for shutting this whole thing down.
Thanks. John, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah. The machine that is prohibition didn't just go away at the vote. There are people that make money off this. There's industries that rely on this. There are areas of the country where the law enforcement really sees marijuana as a tool to get away with a lot. There's a lot of people really invested in the status quo. The pendulum is clearly swinging in the direction of legalization. But if you don't think that those people on the other side are going to try to, no matter what happens, spin it as failure, you're wrong. They will try to spin it as failure. So what can we do to help them spin it as failure? We can be lackadaisical about our messaging, our advertising, do artistic depictions that would tend to target children. Be an irresponsible industry. The banking is a challenge. You know, right now, a lot of the people are working in an all-cash environment. There can be issues with that, issues with organized crime getting into the market. For those that were here for the keynote, the words that were written by Steve D'Angelo about this industry needing to have a soul and needing to have a social conscience. Well, that is because that's the right thing to do, but also because the downside risk in this industry is not just losing your investment money, but it's also federal prison.
By the way, it's funny because whenever I sit with clients, I am obligated to say, oh, and by the way, what you're doing is an unambiguous violation of federal law. And then we smile and we move on with our business. But I wouldn't be a competent lawyer if I didn't warn them every time. So the pendulum swung sharply from the 1970s to the 1980s. And there's a major distinction today. Since the 1980s, 30 years, the grassroots has taken hold and the people have been heard, and a statutory and constitutional in Colorado framework has been established. So it wasn't just sort of cultural and personal preferences. We've really established sort of an infrastructure now that's going to be very, very difficult to dismantle. It's also based on rationality, which isn't necessarily what drives politics. But I do not think we're going back. We will certainly have bumps in the road for economic reasons, for the reasons of public safety, which I think will be borne out. Reduced alcohol consumption, reduced DUIs, teens reporting it's harder to get, teen use down, from what I understand, in Colorado. So yeah, we'll have some incidences, and it's good that there's rapid response, for instance, on the edible issue here in Colorado. Good example of addressing an issue to show that we're responsible. And just to echo what John said, if the industry isn't responsible, you'll sow your own, you'll fashion your own demise. And so I've been encouraging cannabis businesses to distinguish themselves from alcohol and tobacco and really actively not market to children, and say that we are a responsible industry and we're going to protect public safety and promote health and provide fact-based education.
The existential threat I think we face as an industry is the Attorney General. Everyone chuckles that this is federally legal, but that is who holds the right to, as it says in the Controlled Substances Act, the Attorney General may, by regulation, waive the requirement for registration of certain manufacturers, distributors, or dispensers if you find the existence of public health and safety. So public health and safety is our job as an industry to prove we can do it before that regime changes hands and we get to enter the next wave of legislative battle.
Thanks a lot, Eliott. So I've got a whole bunch of excellent questions here, and I guess I would add my quick 2 cents on the existential issue, and I can pontificate for a minute here. But I think, and this was spoke about a bit by Andrew, but the edible issue is a tough one. As someone that wrote the legalization measure here and co-directed the campaign, we didn't necessarily foresee the edible industry leading to some of these high-profile incidents as we've seen in the paper. People are consuming marijuana for they're eating a cookie that's this big and it has 10 doses, and maybe they don't realize that, maybe they do, and they're having very bad experiences, and in some cases tragic experiences. So I think really bringing a thoughtful dialogue and solutions that perhaps even err on the side of over-regulation in the short term for edibles. I just think if we want to have a long-term sustainable edible industry, we got to think hard about how it looks right now. The other thing I would say in terms of how to keep your business functioning, at least for right now, is follow the Cole memo. The direct guidance on this industry from the federal government. Laid out the 8 sort of principles. If you do these 8 things, if you don't do these 8 things, then the federal government is not interested in shutting down your business. So always kind of taking the time to look back at that. We did have an audience member share their thoughts on is there an existential threat to legalization. So I thought this was sort of interesting, but we have an individual who says, I'm concerned about these cannabis businesses going public. A lot of them have had sort of stop trade orders by the SEC. They seem to be a lot of scams, like pump and dump scams that are fleecing investors, and that could really have a major backlash on the industry. I think that's a very good point, and I would note that tomorrow there's a panel, particularly on this sort of going public, how public companies can operate in this space. Andy Telsey, who's a securities attorney in my office, is going to be speaking on that, so please check that out tomorrow. Hammering through some of these questions for our speakers, and maybe we can hit this one pretty quick. We'll do a machine gun round. So how many states will have to legalize cannabis in some form for the federal government to start to act, right, to perhaps reschedule marijuana or move to legalize. So, so basically, what's your predictions on how soon we see action at the federal level? And we'll just start with Andrew and move on down.
I have no great insight into this one, so I actually will take a pass, except somebody asked me how I spell my last name and what is my last name, which I hope is not for nefarious purposes. Andrew Freedman, Freedman. So there you go.
I think that there's going to be serious discussion about it in 2016. 2016 is the next time the world convenes and discusses international treaty. And a lot of what you're seeing now is that the federal government of the United States can't just say, yeah, Washington and Colorado, we're behind you. It's a violation of treaty. And this has got to be handled on an international level. So I think that you're going to see the conversation start there, and hopefully we'll make some progress. But my prediction is it doesn't matter how many states, it's about the international treaty.
I'll stick with my totally seat-of-the-pants prediction that 5 years from now the federal wall of prohibition will come down. I can't believe it's possible, but look where we are now and the change that's happened. There's no movement in Congress, so it really is going to be up to the executive, and the executive does have the power to reschedule and so forth, to introduce enough policy initiatives so that the Controlled Substances Act becomes sort of meaningless.
It's anybody's guess. I'm going to say that the power is where you want to follow. So the big states and the people that have the votes at that treaty level, they're going to be the people that'll make the shift. My vote is New York and Florida will make it happen. So.
Thanks, and I would note too, and yeah, I apologize if I do not get to your question. I'm kind of taking them as they came in. There's a whole bunch, but there is a panel tomorrow on which states are primed to legalize or move forward with medical marijuana, including Rob Campia, who's been just an inspirational leader here in terms of pushing things forward in Colorado and around the country. So do not miss that panel. A couple Washington-specific questions. So what changes to I-502, and that's the legalization law that passed in 2012, do you hope to see in the 2015 Washington legislative session?
So I actually killed a bill at the end of this last session this year, which was not going to serve patients well and was just premature. So we will be amending both initiatives in the next legislative session, the medical marijuana initiative, which was enacted in 1998, and then the initiative 502, the legalization initiative. As I was talking about, sort of aligning them so that patients will be able to go, patients will probably have a card, a state card, that will allow them to purchase significantly more than a general adult use consumer. Retail outlets will need special training if they're going to be providing to medical. Just trying to think of some of the other, basically trying to accommodate those who are truly medically needy. As far as the general adult use market, there are some little tweaks as far as giving the Liquor Control Board certain authorities and so forth. But in general, the system's in place, and we're watching it roll out.
What I think that we're going to need is, first we're going to need to address Washington's taxation, and you're going to see this. There'll be 2-3 stores open up on July 1st. The Liquor Control Board really wants that. They want to show some progress. But the prices that you're going to see, you people in Colorado are going to chuckle and say, my God, I'm glad I'm in Colorado, because the prices in Washington are insane. So we're going to have to come back. Our taxation is too aggressive, and the initiative being written more by the academics made some assumptions about how easy it was going to be to make marijuana, that it was just going to be pennies a gram to produce, which is not going to be the case. We're also going to have to go in and we're going to have to deal with distance relationships. The distance relationships in the initiative have to do with daycares, child centers, that sort of thing. In the federal government, the U.S. attorneys came out and said when the Liquor Control Board said, yeah, we're going to make that common path of travel, i.e. kids don't fly. If you're trying to keep something away from kids, they have to walk there. So you measure 1,000 feet that way. The federal government said, no, we measure property line to property line. But it's governed by Title 21 U.S.C. 860, which if you look at any federal letter that closes a dispensary, it references Title 21 U.S.C. 860, and that doesn't mention anything about daycares, child centers, arcades, any of that. So I want to change the distance relations to that. We need some sort of regulation for medical, and we need to figure out how medical and recreational are going to survive together in the near term until we can get this notion of legalization up. The adult use, general adult use market needs to first be able to supply the general adult use market before it can be assumed that it would be able to serve patients.
I just want to comment on the distances, 1,000 feet from whatever. The state requires that liquor establishments be 500 feet from a school. That's a possible change, but I have to say that politically that's tough in the legislature to get up and say, we want pot shops to be closer to your school. I don't know what legislator is going to step out and propose that, so we might actually be stuck with our, for the moment, with our buffer zones.
I have high hopes. I'm going to build a coalition.
Okay.
You guys will
Let's
have to
work
go
on it.
along.
We'll work on it.
Thanks, Roger and John. A couple of Colorado questions. Andrew, this is, I think, a point of clarification. You said that through April, the state has brought in about $18 million in marijuana taxes. Does that include medical marijuana? Is that pure adult use, licensing fees? Do you have sort of, can you clarify that piece?
That's just from Proposition AA taxes, and so the 15% excise tax and 10% sales tax.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. And this is for Eliott. What are the pros and cons of integrating medical marijuana dispensaries with adult use facilities?
For us, the pros are being able to serve a wider customer base. The restrictions of the medical market also give you advantages, but there's a lot of consumers that don't really want to go through the medical licensing process. So the pros of combining them are wider customer base. The cons are that it costs more. You're paying for essentially 2 licenses at both state and city level, which puts your licensing in the range of $20K a store, $40K a store. So it's not cheap every year. But cheaper than Illinois, which is $100K a year, so.
Thanks, Eliott. Question concerning hemp. What is the status of industrial hemp in Colorado? And maybe we'll ask our Washington colleagues as well. I can speak to Colorado. It was sort of the forgotten issue of the legalization measure in 2012 is we actually did legalize hemp simultaneously. Our voters did, and our state has been, I felt like it was one of those things where hemp became very mainstream overnight. We just legalized marijuana, so everyone's like, what's the big deal with hemp? And our State Department of Agriculture has really thrown themselves into regulating this. Our state is currently giving out 3 types of licenses for individuals to grow hemp. So there are people growing acres and acres of hemp in Colorado right now. It's really phenomenal cultural change. And I think that brings up some possible business opportunities as well. Here we are at the NCIA event, and we have hemp is a pretty viable crop for all sorts of things, but also with these new laws passing, which are fascinating, like CBD-only laws in Florida, and you hear about that in Alabama and other places. Is there an opportunity to grow, very low THC hemp and or have very low THC marijuana and have a lot of CBD? And in fact, we believe that could be grown via a hemp crop in Colorado as opposed to entering the broader recreational market. So, a lot of medical benefits to that side. Roger, can you speak about hemp in Washington, please?
There was a bill introduced and made through the House that didn't make it through the Senate to create a hemp, industrial hemp market. Hemp is legal but unregulated, basically, in Washington. So we need to put it in place. The Republicans in particular are very excited about the hemp market because they represent the eastern part of Washington state, which is more economically hard hit. So it was a Republican bill. And it's very interesting to see, by the way, this, years ago, of course, Republicans tended to be against this, but now they see tremendous economic opportunities in their communities. We were going to vote on a marijuana-related bill, and there was a weather problem, and a number of Republicans couldn't make it to the chamber. And so I just thought it was interesting that we had to put on hold the vote on a marijuana bill in the legislature to wait for the Republicans to get to the chamber. I thought that was interesting. But we'll get hemp done.
Thank you. And sort of a follow-up on that, I've got a couple questions from the audience concerning just the issue I was speaking about, the CBD-specific medical marijuana bills, where that are being passed in numerous states, and my guess is will continue to be passed. Thoughts on the CBD-only bills? Throw that out. Maybe Eliott or John could kind of address that. There's some thought that these could be a box canyon, and if a place like Florida passes a CBD bill, then they've done enough, and they're not going to do anything more for medical marijuana. They've already helped the sickest of the sick, but it is helping some people. So could you guys give your thoughts on those bills, please?
Not mine. Oh. And it's exactly that. You're seeing these used as tools as a last. When you read the polls, medical marijuana in the United States actually polls slightly. The people that have a favorable impression of it actually polls slightly higher than apple pie. That's a fact. And the Republicans and Democrats are seeing this, and all people involved, even those people that are invested heavily in the status quo, as many politicians are. They've been propping this up for 30 years. They have their financial backers are people that like the status quo. They're using the CBD only thing to do exactly what Brian was saying, oh, you don't need marijuana. We've got CBD. And then they're saying, oh yeah, but only the strain Charlotte's Web, which is, for those that grow, we all know that's kind of interesting in itself. But I don't see it, marijuana in itself is not just CBD, and it's not just THC. And lots of research has to do on it, to be done on it, but the CBD bills are simply ways to prevent the inevitable, which is medical marijuana.
I guess the short version I'd say is we're trying to free the plant, not one teeny fraction of the plant. If we continue to allow CBD only, you're really talking about big pharma and molecular grade science versus legalizing a plant.
Question concerning the sort of backdoor threats to legalization, and by that I mean we see things like the Water Reclamation Board not allowing state legal marijuana grows to have water because the water itself is being held in federal facilities, or we have some threats of prosecution against power companies because power companies are providing marijuana for these businesses. So thoughts, Roger or John or others, about kind of...
Yeah, I have a number of clients in the Columbia River Basin who are freaking out about the Bureau of Reclamation's position that water cannot be used to grow a federally prohibited product. Bureau of Reclamation, this is just one example, but it is not a enforcement body. So they can say all they want that they're going to take your water rights away, but in fact it's the U.S. Justice Department that initiates those actions. There's a pissing match basically going on within the federal government now between bureaucrats who don't like this stuff. And I'm not as concerned about the Bureau of Reclamation threatening to limit water or to take water rights away, because it would be up to the Justice Department to take action, and the Justice Department's already given us guidance that as long as we're doing what we're doing, they're going to let it go ahead. I'm trying to think of some other backdoor threats. Did you mention any others? Or,
Well, certainly there's banking and tax
Yeah.
and the IRS, and a lot of federal agencies are threatening legalization in some way, shape, or
Yeah,
form.
I mean, there's so for instance, we have quite a number in Colorado too, native, Indian nations, and the Yakima tribe has filed suit to prevent any cannabis businesses on not only Yakima Reservation, but all of its trust lands, which includes about a third of all of Washington State. It's not going to be successful, and so we hear some griping and some crying. Ultimately, if problems do arise, I know that our governor, who's a friend of mine, and our attorney general, who's a friend of mine, will go straight to the federal government. I'll be with them, saying, "Come on, let's whatever the problem is, let's iron it out." So it might be backdoor threats, but I don't see it bringing down the system.
The real cutting edge of the war right now, and if you ask Sam Patrick Kennedy's group what they're working on, what their focus is, banks, period. That is they've got their heels dug into that, and they don't want to give on banks, because once we have banks, we have legitimacy. So that's really what a lot of their strategy is, and if you look at it, there's been many statements that have been made to that effect.
So final question, I'd like all the speakers to speak on this briefly. If you look at the talking points of the opposition to marijuana reform, it's interesting to see how they shift over time, right? For a long time, it was your brain on drugs, and marijuana makes you kill people back in the 30s, what have you. Now the real talking point is, this is big marijuana, right? It's just like big tobacco. They're trying to hike up the THC rates to get your kids addicted, and they're marketing this in gummy bears, and they're trying to destroy the fabric of American society. So my question for the panel is, how do we, as an industry, and the folks here today, how do we avoid this sort of casting of this net that's calling this industry big tobacco or big marijuana? How do we get around that? How do we act responsibly? So maybe start with Eliott.
Unfortunately, some of the legislation has driven it to be bigger money. So I don't know about the big per se, but we have to keep pushing for, as individuals, normalization. We are people who choose cannabis over wine, or maybe with wine, but we're choosing something. It's adult choice, adult use. Medical is one aspect of that. This is about freedom of choice to use a plant as part of your lifestyle. And that normalization is what's going to push back, showing that you can show up and do your job every day and still consume cannabis is going to help chip this fear. We're not bad people. We just like cannabis.
That should be on your gravestone. We're not bad people. We just like cannabis. So I think messaging is really important, and citing evidence. So I'm assuming that beer consumption will go down, as it has in Colorado, that DUIs will go down, that kids find it harder to get, that kids use it less, that people have access to medical treatment they didn't have before. So reporting that good news, I think, is, and this is what I'm doing. I'm running for re-election now, and people are challenging me, like, what about this, this marijuana legalization? And I say, well, so far it's working out pretty well. Plus, we're bringing in revenue. So reporting that good news, it really helps to dampen concern over. I'll talk again about when I was with Jimmy Carter, Patrick Kennedy, and Kevin Sabet were at that meeting too in Atlanta. They invited Washington State and Colorado folks to come they were sort of taking us to task for, destroying America's children and so forth. And I kept saying, this is about regulating a market. Don't you want to regulate the market to protect public safety, to protect children? And they really got uncomfortable because they knew it was a rational argument. And the other thing is to say, to put the burden on you as industry members, not to market to children and to message properly yourselves, and not to be big marijuana. In Washington State, we've legislated intentionally not to allow for big marijuana. So we don't have vertical integration, and you can only have a certain number of licenses, and you can only grow a certain amount. So, and that's actually the legacy of the liquor control system in Washington State back from 1933, the three-tier system, the tied house system, where we encourage small businesses rather than large businesses.
Big marijuana, coming to get your children. Let's talk a little bit about Big Prohibition. 1937, when we got into this mess, cannabis preparations alongside with bare heroin were available without prescription at pharmacies without any age restrictions whatsoever. Smoked cannabis was almost unheard of in the United States. However, at the time, citing homicidal mania, marijuana was made illegal and prohibition begun. In that time, from a time where cannabis was almost unheard of and widely available, actually, we now have grown to a society which we are a little less than 5% of the population, and we use 25% of the world's marijuana supply. How's prohibition doing? In countries like Holland that have taken approaches where adults can get a regulated supply, you know what their youth rates are compared to ours? Much less. Portugal as well, when they decriminalized all drugs, the usage rates for children went down. And that's in itself a good thing. But let's look at what else went down. Youth use of other drugs went down a lot. Youth availability of other drugs went down a lot. Addiction rates, overdose rates, you name it, they went down because we regulated. Businesses regulation. You want to talk to me about big marijuana? Let's talk about big prohibition, and let's talk about what hasn't worked and what we're going to do to put some regulation in, because we're actually going to decrease youth use. Thank you.
We have a very nice woman in the back who's been waving a stop sign for about the last 30 minutes, so I'm going to be really quick here. We have in the governor's office something called wildly important goals, and ours on this one is youth prevention, which we measure by Healthy Kids Colorado. And last 30-day use, we have public safety, which we're going to mention. We're going to measure by hospital room mentions, DUIDs, accidents, and we have preventing substance abuse, people losing their jobs from alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, substance abuse. And so those are the things we're going to measure, and we don't have to call it anything. We just have to win the we win the statistics with that.
Great. Well, let's give a round of applause. This is a really fantastic panel. Great way to start the two-day conference, and I'm sure some of our speakers will maybe mill about if you have any further questions. Thanks so much.